As a recap, the period between May 30th to July 15th during the Constitutional Convention, we witnessed intense debates centered around the distribution of power between populations or states, or the House and the Senate. However, on July 17th, after the Great Compromise was first being implemented, the focus had shifted to the executive branch, marking a new phase in the convention's deliberations. While the discussions did remain spirited, the debates surrounding the executive branch were generally less heated, but still not without disagreements.
The time has come, the fight is on. We've picked the man to run for president. Ohio sent her noble, worthy son.
The morning of July 17th began with further discussions on the balance of power between the legislative and state branches. However, by noontime, the conversations quickly transitioned to the executive branch. The first ever vote revolving around the executive branch determined that the executive would be a single individual, which passed unanimously 10 to 0. The next vote addressed the method of selecting said executive. Mr. Morris of Pennsylvania vehemently opposed the idea of the executive being appointed by the legislative, arguing that it would make the executive a mere puppet of the legislative rather than being a check and balance on the legislative. Instead, he advocated for the election of the executive by the free men of the nation. Quoting him directly, quote, "They will never fail to prefer some man of distinguished character or services, some man, if he might so speak, of continental reputation. If the legislative elect, it will be the work of intrigue, of cabal, and of faction." Back to paraphrasing the rest of his sentence, the election would be like that of the Pope and Cardinals if the legislative was in charge of electing the executive, and no one of real merit would get the title. And so, Mr. Morris of Pennsylvania moved to switch the system of voting of the president to the citizens of the United States. Mr. Sherman of Connecticut would heavily disagree. He would argue that the sense of the nation would better be expressed by the legislative, and that the people would never be informed enough on the candidates. Thus, people would just vote for someone from their state, ever preventing someone from getting a majority of the votes, and thus the largest states would probably end up in control here. Then James Wilson would talk, and Wilson is often described as the main architect of the presidency, and he was known as a very prolific speaker in the discussions, especially when it revolved around the presidency. Wilson would go on and talk about his views that both systems have flaws, but he had a particular objection to the legislative electing the president, due to the fact that that would make the executive a puppet if he wanted to keep his job, which they were looking to create a check and balance on the legislative. Mr. Pinckney of South Carolina would also object to the people voting, as the legislative, and I quote, "being most immediately interested in the laws made by themselves, will be most attentive to the choice of a fit man to carry them properly." It would be noted that the original idea of the executive would be more of a secretary in a sense. The idea of being able to veto wasn't yet implemented. That would be implemented shortly in their original discussions, but the idea of the president and the executive would be to enforce the laws and not be a major policymaker. So that's why Mr. Pinckney of South Carolina thought that the legislative would best be able to choose their own enforcer. Back and forth, multiple people would go, with the arguments being that the legislative should elect the executive because they are most interested and smart enough to pick adequate characters, while the free men would be unable to do so. Or that the free men should elect because the legislative is corrupt and would make the executive no more than a puppet of themselves. The second vote of the day would be pertaining to the executive branch, or pertaining on the executive branch, would be if the election for the executive was by the freemen of the country. It would fail 9 to 1, with Pennsylvania being the only yay. Martin would put forward the vote that the executive be chosen by the legislatives of said states. This would also fail 8-2, with Delaware and Maryland voting in favor. The next vote would be on an election by the National Legislative. That would pass 10-0, which means that as of July 17th, the executive would be elected by Congress, and then the next vote would be on term limits. And while the vote was going to be on a 7-year term, they decided to postpone that as they could not agree on how long a term should be. Then there was the idea that the executive would be in power for as long as, quote, good behavior occurred, which means supposedly that as long as the executive did nothing illegal and Congress was happy with them, they would stay. Which would once again go back to the idea that originally their idea of a president far more of an enforcer of Congress rather than a opposition to Congress. But however, that idea would fail 6-4. And that would conclude the July 17th votes on the executive branch. The very next day, July 18th, the states would vote 8-0, would reconsider allowing a second term to the executive branch. On July 18th, Georgia would not be present at all, and New Jersey wouldn't show up until later into the day. The executive veto was also approved that day, along with the two-thirds veto override from the legislative branches. On July 18th, the discussion also expanded to include the national judiciary. The initial idea of the judiciary was that the executive would appoint judges without any approval from the Senate. And so a president would just appoint like a Supreme Court justice. And this led to the deliberations on the role of the Senate and the executive in the nomination process. The first vote, which would allow the Senate to be involved in the nomination process, failed 6-2. The discussion moved on that the legislative themselves would appoint the judiciary, including the House, but Mr. Gorham of Massachusetts would argue that the two-branch was too much for that, and thus just the upper house, aka the Senate, should be in charge of these nominations, and the executive would have some say in nominating the individuals. James Wilson of North Carolina thought that that idea was okay, although he did state that he preferred just executive appointments of the judges. Both Martin and Sherman also thought that the Senate should have a say, as all the states would be best informed. Mr. Mason would bring up the point that if the judiciary was a judge and jury for cases of impeachment on the executive branch, then surely it would be unwise for said judiciary to be appointed by the executive branch. And even though the impeachment process had not been fully fleshed out yet, that was the general idea that that was going to be how it was going to play out. It should be noted that during these discussions on the judiciary, it was quite quickly ruled out that the House would have anything to say on it, and it was uh, easily decided that either the Senate or the executive would be the only people who would have any say on it. This would be, I would assume, I didn't find a source backing this up, that this would be a counterbalance to the fact that the House gets to play with the money, the Senate gets to play with nominations. Well, that's how it would end up in the end. Mason also believed that if the executive branch would spend his term of upwards 7 years in a particular state, wherever the executive branch would end up being located, then he would grow attached to that state, and thus people of good character outside the state would be ignored in favor of locals. Gorham would actually argue that's why the Senate wouldn't be able to pick a judiciary candidate alone. Surely senators would only want people from their own states, while the executive would want to look through all the states. Madison would chime in and suggested an appointment by the executive with approval from one-third of the Senate. Sherman wanted the Senate to appoint due to the fact that it would be harder to trick 100 men than it would be to trick one. A vote for the appointment of judges from just the executive branch would fail 2-6. After that fail, Gorham would put forward a vote for a nomination and appointment by the executive with the consent of the Senate. That vote ended up failing 4-4, and that's when Madison would chime in. Madison decided following that idea that the executive would nominate the judges and the Senate would have X amount of days to disagree with the executive, with two-thirds needed to disagree. That vote was postponed, but while the rest of the day went to the powers of the judiciary, what we just discussed, this really began showing the thought process on how we ended up with Washington, D.C. A lot of the discussion about the judiciary was about people growing attached to their states and the executive also growing attached to a state. And we also begin seeing the cooperation of the Senate and the executive branch when it came to appointments. And like I said, the rest of this day switch back to just the powers the judiciary has. So the rest of this day will be dealt in another video. On July 19th of the Constitutional Convention, several revotes from the previous 2 days pertaining to the executive branch would happen. First off, in a vote 8-2, the executive branch would be open to re-election. In a 5-3-2 vote, the idea of a 7-year term failed, but 9-1, a 6-year term was agreed to. And that was all the voting for the day pertaining to the executive branch. However, that does not mean there was no further progress on the executive branch. Much of the discussion of the method of electing the president was talked upon on July 19th. Here we can begin seeing the earliest forms of the Electoral College being born. One Mr. Rufus King of Massachusetts would propose that an appointment of the executive by electors chosen by the people would be liable to the fewest objections. This would lead to Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts putting forward a vote in favor that the executive would be elected by electors to be chosen by the state executives. Thus, in his mind, the people elected the House, the state legislatives elected the Senate, and the state governors elected the president. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut changed the electors chosen by the state executives to electors appointed by the state legislatives. One for each state with under 200,000 people, two for each state with over 200,000 people, and three for each state with more than 300,000 people. And this right here, this was the baseline for the Electoral College that we know of today, in which states would gain electors based on a ratio of how many people they have, and it would be those electors that would actually elect the president. However, originally he did have only the state legislatives picking the electors and not the people voting on the electors. While, of course, the number of electors and the ratio of them would be postponed from being voted on, the idea that the president was appointed by electors did pass 6-3-1. And the electors shall be chosen by the state legislators was also passed 8-2. And it was decided that the president would be paid a fixed amount of money and out of the national treasury that day as well. Following these deliberations, the discussions surrounding the executive branch came to a temporary conclusion until early August. It is worth noting that the concept of the presidency on July 20th differed in some aspects of the final version. For example, the proposed 6-year term that was implemented July 19th would be later revised to 7 years without the possibility of re-election on July 26th. However, when the Committee of the Detailed reconvened on August 7th, further discussion took place over the course of several weeks, which would bring the presidency a lot closer in line of what we have today. And by early September, the version of the presidency that we would recognize today began to take shape. And those revisions made during the months of August and September will be explored in future videos highlighting the intricate development of the president's role in our Constitution. However, over these few days that we saw the basically the seeds being planted of the idea of Washington, D.C., mostly due to judiciary picks. We saw the idea that the Senate gets to do nominations and not the House. We also saw the very first thought process behind the Electoral College. And that would be all for today. And thank you guys so much for watching. My name is now the Florida Paleo Libertarian. I'm sure as you have seen my rebrand, and I think it's a good rebrand for me personally. It's very much in line with my politics. And the reason I moved away from William Taft Stan is I feel like it didn't communicate correctly what I was in at least on the YouTube platform. On Twitter, I'm still William Taft Stan, but thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and you all have a wonderful day.